first days of the North Kingdom, they built a great watchtower on Weathertop. Amon Sûl, they called it. It was burned and broken, and nothing remains of it now but a tumbled ring, like a rough crown on the old hill's head. Yet once it was tall and fair. It is told that Elendil stood there watching for the coming of Gil-galad out of the west in the days of the last alliance. I'm guest co-host Mark Caldwell, and you're listening to the Amon Sûl podcast.
My Govanan, welcome to Amon Sûl, a podcast for tall hobbits with entish aspirations. I'm Father Anthony, an Orthodox Christian priest, and here we talk about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien because we love them and believe in their power to orient us toward what is highest and noblest. Today, my guest co-host is Mark Caldwell. Mark is a professional arborist in southwestern Ohio. He's a member of St. Paul Orthodox Church here in Dayton, where I live. He and his wife have 4 children, and I'm blessed to see them all fairly frequently at various events at my parish or his parish, although we've almost never had a chance to actually sit down and talk together until now. So I'm really looking forward to this. Mark, welcome to the Amon Sûl podcast.
Thank you for having me, Father.
I know it's a bit of a different thing doing the podcast recording and doing it over the computer and all of this. I'm grateful for your patience with this. We were saying before we started recording that doing a video podcast was kind of out of my comfort zone and still is out of my comfort zone. I'm going to blame Father Andrew Damick for that. He has been trying to shift the content, I think, more in that direction. So he said, Father Anthony, you can take over the podcast, but what if you do it in video? And I'm like, do I gotta? And he's like, it'll be fun. Come on. So here we are. I'm in my basement, and you're in, I'm not going to ask what room that is, but it's close to the internet. Glory to God. So, on our episode today, Mark and I will be talking about the 6th chapter of Lord of the Rings, entitled The Old Forest. His professional expertise, I think, will be very valuable as we reflect on the strange human relationship with trees and forests, and I'm thrilled that you agreed to join me today, Mark. But before we get started on all that, why don't you lead off by telling us a bit more about yourself, whatever you'd like to share, and how you first came to connect with the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. What's your first memory of that, or whatever you want to say about that?
I would say probably my first memory, I guess, when I remember reading one of Tolkien's books. I have an uncle who was very influential in my life, especially in my uh, tween years. And he was always sort of filling in my reading schedule with what he considered very important books for me that he could tell were not on my bookshelf. Um, and one of those was The Fellowship of the Ring. He just handed it to me one day and said, "You need to read this. Tell me what you think." And I remember laying on my grandmother's floor, and my parents, sort of walking by. What is this? What is this book you're reading? Is it about magic?
Right.
The suspicions of a parent. Um, and the more I read, I was like, well, no, not exactly. Even as a child, I have many fond moments of being in the woods, and sometimes even being in the woods alone. I think I didn't come to appreciate or even understand Tolkien like I think I do now. But I did very much love the passages about trees. I've been an arborist for I think about 15 years. So most of my career has been surrounding mostly residential tree work, but also we end up doing a lot of forest work too throughout that time. So just spending time in the forest, I think, has probably done as much for my education as any certifications have over the years. And brushing shoulders with other folks who spend lots of time around trees, I think, has been almost as much, if not more, influential in my love for trees. So yeah, but I would say probably the fondest memory I have, and maybe you're aware of this too. the school that you attended, where my wife also went to college. They had recordings of The Lord of the Rings read by Tolkien
Right.
himself, and she would check those out at the library and pass them off to me. And when I would go to visit her up in Michigan, I would click those on and listen to those for that 2 hour drive there and back. And I found that to be enlightening, I guess. The way he reads his stories and the way he pronounces and speaks for the characters with different voices, I
Sure.
think kind of gave me a different sense of the story than I read myself.
Right, and that makes a lot of sense because I was actually struck. You pronounced all the names correctly in the in the introduction there, and it's one of those things I kind of look at because I did not pronounce them correctly. I was resistant. I was homeschooled, and I had very much my own sense of how the names were supposed to be pronounced, and I didn't bump into those recordings of Tolkien reading them until I was, well, old enough and arrogant enough to think that I knew better than he did, and it's been a matter of some resistance. But yeah, if you got if you heard it from the author's mouth, then yeah, it's a different sense of what the story is about than perhaps the reader necessarily picks up on. I think I know what you're talking about with that.
Yeah, one of the most striking things was in The Hobbit, the way he even just the way he pronounces Gollum's name, and then, the way he speaks for him, the voice he uses, wasn't what I imagined,
Right.
so
And it's not Andy Serkis at all, as I recall, but I haven't listened to that for an
yeah,
age. I should go back.
yeah, yeah.
Very good. So, one more question, just to get some sense of how you personally interact with Tolkien's works. Let me ask, if you had to pick one, what character in all of his works would you most like to be like? I think that was the question you had selected. We gave you options, but
Yeah, in some ways, there are sort of 2 characters that I would like to be like, and I say that probably because, um, one I think would be Sam, just because
mhm,
uh, he embodies many, noble characteristics that I'm not sure I possess myself. His sort of quiet loyalty,
mhm,
throughout, is, I think, just admirable in so many ways. Um, I guess the other character, I kind of, sort of wish to be is that, Tom Bombadil is like kind of like this, uh, almost unimaginable character who is like the spirit of the trees.
mhm.
You don't find like other Tom Bombadils, or at least I don't recall. And I just think that you know in my daily life, I wish I could whisper to a tree and help it along its way. I spend a lot of my time diagnosing tree problems
Mm.
and sort of yearning for a better forest and a better um, ecological world. And I feel like he's sort of the spirit of that in the book. We all, my patients don't speak to me. They just sort of stand there lifeless, as what most people would see, and you have to try to get a whole history of a tree sometimes to try to figure out what's wrong with it. And you know that character has that ability. So anyway.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense, and something I've been reflecting on with Sam's character especially is i i all of the hobbits spend a lot of time talking about how much they miss the Shire, and Sam does this too, but in a very real sense, Sam sort of is the Shire. Everything that is best about it. The solid, stable, grounded, rooted wholesomeness of it. Sam is aspirational, I think, for a lot of us. Not that he's perfect, but yeah. And Bombadil, well, yeah, Bombadil is a whole nother thing. I think we'll get to talk a little bit about Tom Bombadil as we get to him here at the end of the chapter. But since you talked about your work, perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about what an arborist does, what sort of calls you get in the course of an average day or week, and maybe even what the treatment options end up being. Not to ask you
Yeah.
for like free advice here, but
Yeah. Most of my life entails sort of reaching out to respond to, I guess, the needs of the local community in regards to trees. Sometimes, I have some relationships with estates or large properties where I'm a regular presence, sort of watching over what's going on with the trees on their property. That involves staying up to date with invasive species and staying up to date with local soil characteristics and even kind of staying abreast of typical issues for typical trees in certain sites and trying to figure out solutions for keeping trees healthy. We, of course, have a whole other side of our work that does involve uh, mitigating risks and dealing with emergencies. And, it involves tree removal. It involves plant health care to the effect of sometimes dealing with invasive species or soil amendments to improve certain sites for trees. Um, in our area, in developed uh, landscapes where homes were built, the ground was flattened and compacted, and then we just install a single tree that would normally exist in a forest, and we just expect it to need nothing. And so there's a lot of conversations that I have and a lot of methods that we use, essentially to try to make properties a little bit more like a forest, in some ways, to kind of bring a healthy environment for trees. So
sure.
yeah, yeah.
Beautiful. All right. Well, thank you for introducing yourself to us and to the listeners and really to me, because as I said, this is the first time we've had more than like 60 seconds to say hello in passing. So I'm really glad to have you along, and yeah, let's move on to our next segment. All right, so now let's get to some of the listener questions and comments. I am super excited, even boastful, to note that our first listener comment is only 3 weeks old. I think that's a record for a response turnaround here at Amon Sûl. This comes from Father David in West Virginia. He writes, Dear Father Anthony, in the latest episode, you were speaking about the hobbits' practice of not speaking about marriage until it's a fact, and you referenced Sam and Rosie. While it's true that we never learn about Rosie and Sam's attachment until almost the end of the book, there is a hint of it much earlier, though it's only to be seen in retrospect. At the scene where the company first meets Galadriel, she looks deeply at each of them, and Sam blushed, saying that he felt as if I hadn't got nothing on, and that he felt like he was being given the chance of flying back home to the Shire to a nice little hole with a bit of garden of my own. That catch seems to have been him about to say, a nice little hole with rosy cotton, but Hobbit secrecy kept him from saying anything. And then he also says, I've noticed Tolkien's reversal of sacred geography, with the west being the sacred direction and the east being the place of evil, and I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Father David, I have some thoughts about sacred geography, but I really want to bring in some people who are more expert on that before I address that, so we're going to put a pin in that one. But I really like what Father David points out. Yet another point where the fact that Sam's leaving of the Shire with Frodo has had a deeper cost for him personally than we've known. That he's ready and eager even to be married, but he hasn't talked about this with anyone. But the desire, and therefore the temptation, is still there. that's not an aspect of this of Sam going with Frodo that I'd considered yet. And I'm struck how it even reveals Sam as the character perhaps most similar to Tolkien himself, as he too had once left his beloved to go and do his duty in the war. So, Mark, what are your thoughts on all this?
I was talking with my wife about this, and I said to some extent, I think so many folks in our culture, not just people we meet, but even ourselves, have moments in our lives where we have to do this, and it is very difficult.
Mm,
And those moments, I think, change and shape us. And I think having characters uh, with that experience really makes a strong connection both
mm,
to this noble act, but also some of us maybe our act isn't as noble as going off to war,
mm,
but going off for work or going
mm.
off to help someone. You know, I think we share in that experience. Many of us do, and I find it a great descriptor of Sam. A person who I think in some ways we all aspire to be.
Sure.
Um, and that's what comes to my mind.
Yeah, you're putting me in mind. I know you've just sent your oldest off to to college within the last well, I guess the last year. I'm facing that same thing now, and I recall bumping into something. Now, this isn't about a wife, but that larger reality of the family. Uh, just kind of thinking about the number of moments, the number of hours that we spend with the most important people in our lives, and how relatively few, uh, how relatively small a percentage that is, even for the most important people. But for our children, that probably three-quarters or more of the time we'll spend with them in our entire lives are done by the time they're 17, 18. And even with our spouse, then, coming kind of back to where we started, we live with these people. They're the most important people for us, but most of our time is not spent with them. It's spent out doing the work of sustaining the household, of living life. It's a balance that it's always a struggle to find. Yeah, I don't know how to.
Yeah, you find with Sam, ultimately, if he doesn't do it, you look at the end of the story, what does he have to come home to?
Right,
So the if you don't leave, sometimes if you don't leave, you'll have nothing to come home to. It's sort of
right,
that difficult, uh, paradox. I don't know,
sure,
that pulling apart. You have to pull things apart to put them back together.
right.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
know, we can talk about that. There's almost an appropriate inversion. Is Sam leaving Rosie, abandoning her to go out and do his duty, or is she sending him out as an extension of their plans and their hopes for the future, as a sacrifice that she's making as well, and all of that can get propagandized in different contexts. But there is that reality once, even once you are married, once you're living that life, are you abandoning your family to go out and do the work, or is that your role in the household? And I think,
yeah,
like you kind of hinted, it's very much the latter. But it's a struggle, it's a pain, a matter of grief, realizing, well, I'm not spending my life or as much of it as I wanted with the people that are beloved to me. So,
yeah. It reminds me of a phrase in scripture, and I don't know my chapter and verse, but if I go to make a place for you,
right.
so that we can be together.
I like that quote, and I think that might be relevant even as we come to the end of the conversation, but for a different
Yeah,
reason.
sure.
But anyway, maybe we'll come back to that later. Anyway, let's move on. Our second listener comment is a thoughtful reflection from listener Keith that he sent toward the beginning of May, so a couple months ago. Mark, would you read this one?
Sure. Yeah. Your recent episode with a first time reader of The Lord of the Rings episode 115 with Zach Heller was great. And in that conversation, you touched several times on envying to some extent his experience of getting to read The Lord of the Rings for the first time. And of course, reading it as an adult rather than as a child or teen would be very different. I'd love to be able to read the novels for the first time, but struggling to imagine not having read the books as wise and friendly companions over the 40 odd years I've known them.
Mm.
This also got me thinking about the sacraments. Sometimes Protestants criticize the Orthodox for giving sacraments to children too soon, before they know what it is that they're experiencing. Similarly, one will occasionally hear criticisms of low church Protestants, quote, delaying God's gifts. This can be true of the Eucharist, chrismation, or even baptism. Internal to The Lord of the Rings, we also have several experiences in which characters do things almost too late, or in a few cases, too soon. But often there's an internal logic, not simply driven by the needs of the plot, but also by character, for the timing. For example, Frodo, when he arrives safely at Rivendell, ends up reflecting that if he had left earlier, they could have traveled without any trouble whatsoever. But had he done so, he would have missed out on the experience of meeting Strider along the way, and would have missed meeting Bombadil. Similarly, the hobbits would never have been lost on the Barrow Downs, and Merry would not have had the sword he used to strike down the Witch King. These experiences certainly helped forge their characters for the challenges to come. Those quiet years in the Shire gave Frodo and his friends roots and depth.
Mm.
As a middle-aged man myself, I often reflect on Bilbo and Frodo having their great adventures in their 50s. In contrast, Aragorn's use of the Palantir and the Hornburg was almost too soon for his strength to bear after many sleepless nights and hard battle. And of course, the response from Mordor was even more swift than he had intended. But his use of this gift was critical, not just to the plot, but also to strengthening his own will, making him an even better man and a greater and wiser king. He would not have taken the paths of the dead without it. I wonder if, in God's providence, all times are a right time. As soon as we become aware of God's grace, ought we to take advantage of it rather than waiting for some ideal of the best time? This requires prudence, and of course, there is some preparation that may be required. One could be baptized as an infant, or required to have a year or more of time as a catechumen, or like the Ethiopian eunuch, be baptized as an adult immediately, or even as a penitent on one's deathbed. Each could be the right time. We need to be grateful for the gifts we've been given, not envious of what He gives to others in their own fullness of time. I'm sure you'll be able to develop other examples of the early versus late dichotomy, and I'd be very interested in your and your co-host's thoughts.
So I think this is a fascinating and a beautiful email, but I want to give you the first crack at this, Mark. What do you think of this? Any thoughts on what is or isn't the right time? Is there indeed not actually a time and season for every purpose under heaven? Not to load the dice for your response, but
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot. I can even sense in the question, this sense that almost that the only real time is now. I mean, not that the history isn't very important, but you can always look back and see God's hand in things. I think for me, I very much am reminded of our common introductory prayer, that who art everywhere present and fills all things. That phrase sticks with me a lot. And it came to mind immediately during that question. We live in a world with a God that may seem to live uh, not so noticeably. He lives outside of time, but exists in the present for us.
mm,
Um, I guess there's always that experience or that question that we have as humans, where we experience, where is God, or where is more of Him?
mm,
When is God? you know, and I think uh, we're always faced with this like deep sense of being present with being recognizing God in the moment and in the
mhm,
place we are in. Those are the thoughts that stand out to me the most in that question. So I see the logic, developing in the question. um, uh, perhaps looking back, we see there is a time for everything. How does that um, how does that equip us, for now? Yeah, I guess, for the now. But
Right, right. Uh, I like where you're going with that, and I think you're right. As especially, now now is the time. Today is the day of salvation. If we will hear the voice of the Lord, today is the day of salvation. So as we'll say, of course, God is present at all times and all places. He is never absent from us. So when we experience his absence, then we generally are invited to turn the lens back on ourselves and say, okay, in what way then am I absent from God? Um, but I don't, and I was kind of joking, saying, is there not actually a time and purpose for everything? Because I think the two things go together. In our in the humility that we are called to embrace and in which we are called to live, uh, we have to receive everything that comes to us in the time that it comes and endeavor to respond to it in a way that is faithful because the Lord is present at all times. And I like what the listener, I like what Keith said. How did he say it? In He says, I wonder if in God's providence all times are a right time, um, which could be read two ways. It could be by God's providence, because God is actively managing all of this. All times are a right time, because He will make the time right for each person. But maybe we could also flip that and say, when we are living in communion with God, when we are open to His will, all times are a right time. He will work all things together for good for those who love Him. Uh, or all times are an occasion in which we can encounter God. There are a lot of different ways we can go there. Ultimately, I have to acknowledge there's a mild rebuke, I think. Well, I hope it's mild, of Keith to me for my expressed envy of the first time reader of Lord of the Rings, and it's a fair point. I wouldn't trade it. I wouldn't trade the fact that I read these works a long time ago and have had them as companions for most of my life. Um, but I remember the sweetness of reading it the first time, and I wish I could have it again, which is not a good wish, but still a real one, perhaps. Um, there's a lot more we could say about this, though.
I had one other thought that came to me just now. I've often heard I've read various Catholic and Orthodox on this subject over my time being in the Orthodox Church, and I myself was actually a little hesitant at that I was a catechumen for too short.
Right.
I thought it should have been extended longer. Even in the moment, I thought, I should be waiting longer. But I followed the lead of my spiritual director, and I don't have to worry. I don't have to look back and worry about that. Um, and I think it's interesting when in one of the passages of the gospel, when Jesus is referring to, this worry about what should you have. I mean, perhaps you could extend that out to, when's the right time? Is this the right person? Is this the right moment? Um, you know, Jesus gives us uh, he draws us back to looking at nature in some ways,
Mm.
and the sort of restfulness that it has. Consider the lilies of the valley.
Right.
Um,
Right.
you know, um, I've often read that the other spiritual book besides the scriptures is nature.
Hmm.
I've heard that phrase before, and sometimes I think we can consider, because I think partly some of this some of this podcast draws on that. So I thought I would at least mention that that was something that came to my mind was perhaps we can draw lessons from nature as well. particularly because Christ tells us how we
Sure.
can.
Although it's important we take the right lesson, not necessarily the
Yes.
lesson from nature red in tooth and claw, seizing what can be seized, but the leaf that falls and endures and accepts the the role that it has, the place that it's given, and trusts.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we are called to trust God, and that is where we can actually encounter Him. Um,
Yeah.
and and that involves acceptance of the times and the circumstances that come to us, and that whether they were right for someone else, they are the path that we've been given. Maybe.
Yeah.
I like that. Anything else you want to say on this, Mark?
No, but I'm glad you brought up I'm glad you mentioned the phrase tooth and claw, because I'm sort of going to be referring to that a little bit later.
Okay, very good.
Sort of one interpretation of nature. Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So I think that's all we've got for questions and comments today. But, dear listener, please feel free to send more to us at Amon Sûl at ancientfaith.com, or you can message us on the Facebook page, and you will probably hear it on an episode to come. Before we move on, I do want to boast a little bit and note that our predecessors never addressed listener questions and comments so quickly as we have done this time. Now, doing a read-through makes it a lot easier to maintain an ongoing conversation, so that boast is rather empty, and I shouldn't be boasting anyway. But regardless, take the encouragement. Please write us if you have thoughts, and you can become part of the conversation. And a few of these people I'm thinking I'm going to have to contact and ask them to come on and speak at more length about this as a guest co-host. So while we're urging you to write to us, please remember also we're always looking for new photograph submissions of landscapes that resemble Weathertop, Amon Sûl, and the Weather Hills approaching it, so we can feature them on YouTube during the podcast opening there. So, if you live or work or commute or vacation under the shadow of Amon Sûl, please share a photo with us. This brings us to the main portion of our episode today. I've asked Mark to come on the podcast to talk about the Old Forest as Frodo and his companions actually leave the Shire, attempt a shortcut to evade and confuse their Black Rider pursuers, and instead find themselves falling afoul of the forest itself before they are rescued in a manner that is completely beyond expectation. Since we can't read the whole chapter aloud, dear listener, I will start with a basic summary of the action, but we do recommend that you simply pause and read this chapter for yourself before continuing with us. It won't take too long. Whether you do so or not, however, here is our chapter outline in 5 acts. So Act 1, leaving Crickhollow. An early waking, Merry pounding on the door, merges with Frodo's dream of the tower and the sea from last chapter. Fredegar, Fatty Bolger, accompanies the 4 hobbits and the 5 ponies to the hedge. He leaves them there and returns to the house at Crickhollow. I emphasize 5 because, without getting into it too much, in an earlier draft, I think Fredegar actually came with them, and that was why they had 5 ponies, and Tolkien never took out the 5th pony. So I guess they had it to carry all of the extra pots and pans and rope that Sam wanted. So he leaves them there and returns to the house at Crickhollow. Merry then leads them through the tunnel under the hedge, unlocks the door, and they leave the Shire. Act 2. The Old Forest on the paths. Merry explains that the trees are dangerous, that the forest is much more alive than the forest outside, or rather inside the Shire. He explains about the hedge that separates the forest from the Shire and how the hobbits once used fire against the forest years ago. You were talking about invasive species, and I think the hobbits are an invasive species to the forest. I know we'll come to that again. So they find the bonfire glade. There are no paths to lead them there, though. And then they do find a clear path leading north out of the glade. So they follow it. They arrive at the top of a hill from which they can see the whole forest, including the valley of the Withywindle to the south. They can't see the road to the north toward which they are aiming, but they can see the Barrow Downs to the east, which they absolutely intend to avoid. They eat lunch there on the hilltop. Act 3. The old forest turns against them. They leave the hill, heading north on a path, but the path turns to the right and then begins to even bear south towards the Withywindle. So they leave the path to continue north, but the forest and the land itself work against them, pushing them ever to the right, to the east, and then ultimately to the south. They find themselves tired and trapped on a path in a deep gully that leads down and right and south towards the river, and they arrive suddenly on the banks of the Withywindle, surrounded by willows. Act 4. Merry goes exploring, and they decide to follow the path that he finds along the river heading east just to get out of the forest. But heat and sleep and something else overtake them. Merry and Pippin fall asleep leaning up against the great willow tree. Frodo sits on a root of the same tree and dips his feet in the river, dozing off. But Sam doesn't fall asleep. He notes that the willow is singing about sleep, and that's suspicious. And then he hears Frodo fall into the river and rescues him, and they both find that the tree has effectively eaten both Merry and Pippin. They try to get them out. They try to burn the tree to make it release them, but Merry screams that the tree says it will break him in two if they don't put the fire out. So Frodo runs in panic along the path and cries out for help. In Act 5, Tom Bombadil. Frodo hears Tom singing as if in answer to his cries for help, just singing silly nonsense rhymes. Then Tom comes into view. They tell him about their friends who are trapped, and he says that's no problem. He knows the tune for Old Man Willow. He sings or chants into a crack in the willow bark, and suddenly the tree releases both Merry and Pippin. He invites them to dinner, and then goes on ahead of them. They follow, and they come to Bombadil's house with its lights shining out into the darkness like a beacon. You mentioned, I go and prepare a place for you, I think, and there is a little bit of something like that with Tom Bombadil. But we'll maybe come to that later. So we'll talk over all of this as we pick some actual excerpts. But I think my own major takeaways here are how small and helpless the hobbits find themselves to be almost the instant that they leave the Shire, and specifically they find I'm struck how immediately the world itself, which they've managed to tame inside the Shire, at least to the point of being able to convince themselves that they have tamed it, although they really haven't. But the world itself turns out to resent that effort of taming and is pushing back against them, and it's pushing hard. So this gives us something of a different picture of the hobbits, as a lot more active and assertive in their domestication of their home, their domination of the nature in which they live, all of them together in cooperation, and that this is precisely because they are weak and vulnerable by themselves. And I'm really struck by the contrast that we see then with Tom Bombadil, who dominates and tames nothing, and yet is the master and fears nothing. So it might be too much to say that the hobbits have tamed their external threats but have not mastered themselves, while Tom exemplifies the opposite, mastery of self without dominating anything else. But I'm kind of hooked on that thought, and that's what leaps out to me. So, Mark, how about you? What do you find of particular note in this chapter, generally speaking, before we jump into reading some specific passages?
Yeah, I do. I do sort of stick with you on that word tame. It struck me as a good description for the experience of being in the forest. A healthy forest is not an easy thing to traverse. If you're lucky enough in a long forest journey, you can sort of figure out where the deer paths are, or some other large animal that uses a common path. Otherwise, if you don't find that, or if no one has cultivated a path, it is very difficult, especially in an old forest. Traversing old forests is, what we might hike a mile in a very a young forest with paths. You put that. You take that experience to an old growth forest without paths, that mile might take you at least twice as much time.
Mm-hmm.
It is just sort of brutal, and you're kind of waiting for the area around you to sort of help you out a little bit. um, I imagine Tolkien himself spent time in some old forests, and I think he communicates a valuable experience that of just being in the forest, just interwoven into the story. Um, um, but in terms of like, yeah, the experience that these the hobbits, I imagine them as being sort of like, or perhaps even elves as being sort of the best there was to offer the forest in a sense, but even they have this conflict,
Mm,
with the forest.
sure.
And yeah, they want immediately to straighten its paths and level its ground, and there's sort of this like battle between the forest and, like, the desire to make it more civilized.
Right.
I could see some of this, interwoven into so many things that Tolkien says. So I do, and sort of stuck on that word tame. The You could say, the history of mankind's taming of the world looks a little bit more like, you know uh, not to sound sacrilegious, crucifixion than
Hmm.
than an English garden. When you see sort of what has been done, some of that I think is deep within Tolkien himself. Our interactions with nature are mostly in conflict.
Right.
Finding ways uh, of smoothing it out. Whereas, the ignorance of the world tamers of what the forest actually wants and needs and how it behaves, as you mentioned, Tom, sort of lives in harmony with it. And I think about his interaction with them and the tree, um, and I sort of imagine some of my own things in this moment. He's helping the hobbits. Is it like kind of an act of charity? Does he actually feel a little more? Does he care more about the tree than the hobbits in that moment? He does go on to sort of press upon the tree to let them go. Um, but you don't imagine this Tom as you don't imagine him being willing to set fire to anything in order to get them out. You just anyway. Um, those things that come to my mind, and I feel like he speaks for the forest in some ways. He's Yeah, yeah.
Right. As an aside, I didn't really pull much from the different drafts of Tolkien's work on this chapter, because for the most part, this chapter really, my memory at least, is really the first time it's written. It almost is without hardly any changes. It comes to us here, which is striking because he changed a lot. But the Old Forest chapter almost springs exactly as it's published, from his pen, in the 30s. Um, but the one thing that I think did see some development is actually the figure of Old Man Willow, himself. I believe there was an idea that it was some sort of other entity that had even a man, a person who had died, and so I need to go back and see it. It may have just been hinted at, but that effectively had possessed the willow tree, and then the malevolence of that will found an alliance with the forest in its defensiveness against cultivation and domesticization, elsewhere. But I think he kind of abandoned making that idea explicit, and so if it
Mm.
still survives, it's implicit, it's beneath the surface. But yeah, Tom is not dominating anything. We'll get to that as we come to the end. I really like what you say. Mankind's taming of the world looks a lot more like the crucifixion than anything else, and that we certainly do look to everything to exploit it, um, to possess it or to bend it to our will, without much attention to what it is for its own sake. And I reflect on this even, to go outside, especially if you're going to go into the forest, you have to treat your clothes for bugs, for ticks, for this, for that.
if you're lucky enough to find a deer path, you have to be very cautious because that comes with its own set
Sure.
of risks. I often find a deer path and I choose not to traverse it because I know what comes along with that are everything that comes along with deer, which are ticks.
Right.
I oftentimes will choose the harder path because, yeah, yeah.
Right. But we've got all these, tick-borne diseases that I don't know how normal those have been in the past. Are
Mm.
those normative in old forests, in old growth forests, or are they, part of the imbalance that has come through our interference with that? Anyway, I may be barking up the wrong tree there, if you'll forgive an idiom, but the remedy would take a long time, even if that is the case, to just let the forest be what it is naturally and learn to exist in a different way. That's not a remedy that any of us would ever see. That requires an entirely different level of stewardship.
Yeah.
Anyway, I have thoughts on this that are not particularly well developed, and I'm sure you have much better to say about that than I. One of the things that we did talk about very briefly that I think is maybe relevant at this point was the way in which the forest functions as a character on its own, not just a collection of individual trees, but as an entity itself. And really, how insightful Tolkien is in viewing the forest in that way, reflecting on what are, to my knowledge at least, more recent insights about the nature of trees and forests and their capacity for action, reaction, communication, memory, and perhaps even something like thought. When I asked you to come on months ago, you suggested I read the book The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wohlleben, I believe is how it's pronounced, on this subject. And I finally managed to read that last month, and I very much enjoyed it. So before we get deeply into the chapter itself, I'd love to hear your more general reflections about the old forest, not just as a chapter, but as an entity, as a character, and forests in general in that regard.
Yeah, I think in some ways, I I have felt like Tolkien was ahead of his time in his characterizations of the forest. I don't, what all he was driving at. There could be a lot of emotions that he has about these things that are finding their way into his writings, and in terms of the word, taming it. A lot of our old models, even sort of our scientific models of understanding how a forest functions, it takes on particularly a very competitive view. um, the old way of looking at a forest was to see everything in as isolated individuals in competition.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Tolkien's description of things uh, doesn't go anywhere near that. uh, you know, he sees the forest as this 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 entity, and science in a lot of the most recent research, some of those things Peter Wohlleben touches on, um, uh, that have shown us that trees have ways of communicating, and they have ways of sharing some of our some of our even some of our forestry practices have been harmful and actually less profitable because they've been based on this assumption, I would say, that all things are in competition.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, in Tolkien, there is this cooperation, and it's literally been proven, by science. Trees share water and nutrients, not just with their own species. So you might even imagine, well, of course, there's this sharing, but they're still sort of like only doing it with sort of their seedlings. But they've actually found that no, it crosses species. And it's not even the trees alone that are doing. It's actually fungal networks that work with the trees that allow this to happen. So it's multiple species uh, that create this healthy uh, oneness that particularly old forests have. It's important to have really old trees in these forests, and it's important to never lose them. in order to even to regrow forests for, like, producing lumber, um, ridding the world of these really old, as they say, mother trees, will decimate the ability of the forest to grow back in a healthy way, leaving, even decimating a forest, but leaving the old ones,
Mm.
um, will rebuild a forest much faster,
Hmm.
and it will keep some invasive things at bay. It'll actually, so it's just interesting. That's one of the things that comes to mind. So yeah, I think that I very much see it as a character, and also something deep within Tolkien that he wants us to feel that, the importance of it. Um, you see that even in, uh, Treebeard's response. At one point, he makes mention that, we are for ourselves because no one is for us. Um, you know, Despite the fact that, years ago the elves, woke them up. It's like things have changed. You know, things are changing, and I think he wants us to feel that for the forest, and see it, as being something that is so crucial to the health of everything. Um, and so yeah, I do very much see it as a character. But
Right.
maybe that's just, me.
Well, and maybe it's worth at this point. I'm gonna share my screen here, and hopefully you can see this as well. So basically, this is what I've got on the screen here is from a map of Middle Earth, and so this kind of is showing some of the, I think, annotations that were made, but that's beside the point, because it gives a picture of this, because Treebeard also says something about how time was that a squirrel could travel all the way from the old forest to Fangorn without ever touching the ground. And that's this distance, if my cursor is visible here. And so the old forest is all that is left of a massively much larger living organism that has suffered, you know, almost unimaginable loss then, if we're thinking of it in those terms. I've heard similar things said about Ohio, where we both live, that Ohio, once was completely forested, but anyone who drives through Ohio kind of rolls their eyes and says, nah, that's not what Ohio is.
Yeah, there's a popular phrase, that, in the old days, a squirrel could go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River
Yeah,
without touching the ground. Yeah, it sort of plays on that.
right. And so yeah, not just a competition, but a real living cooperation, and knowing that, recognizing that, maybe I think that Tolkien presents the old forest here as adversarial and challenging and difficult, but not evil, and that's really striking.
Mhm.
Old Man Willows may be a different story, but uh, anyway, um, while I've got the graphic here, let me at least show a little bit of just what we're talking about in terms of the geography. So they start here, and this is not the best. I know it's pixelated, but they start in Buckland, and they cross over into the old forest. They're trying to go north to the to the road, but instead they get turned and turned towards the south, towards the river, and we can kind of see it's the river doesn't flow due. It flows in a way that makes sense of their journey, but basically this is kind of where they're going. But we see the point. So this is what we're talking about. But with that, I think let's go ahead and actually get into reading some bits from the chapter. Um, so we need to actually see them leave the Shire, since we've waited long enough for it to happen. So Mark, would you read this first excerpt, and then I'll read the second. These are not contiguous, but they give us the waking and then the leaving together, and then we can discuss it. So go
Sure.
ahead.
Frodo woke suddenly. It was still dark in the room. Mary was standing there with a candle in one hand and banging on the door with the other. "All right, what is it?" said Frodo, still shaken and bewildered. "What is it?" cried Mary. "It's time to get up. It is 4:30 and very foggy. Come on. Sam is already getting breakfast ready. Even Pippin is up. I'm just going to saddle the ponies and fetch the one that is the baggage carrier. Wake the sluggard Fatty. At least he must get up and see us off." Soon after 6 o'clock, the five hobbits were ready to start. Fatty Bulger was still yawning. They stole quietly out of the house. Mary went in front, leading a laden pony, and took his way along a path that went through a spinney behind the house, and then cut across several fields. The leaves of trees were glistening, and every twig was dripping. The grass was gray with cold dew. Everything was still, and far-away noises seemed near and clear. Fowls chattering in a yard, someone closing a door of a distant house. In their shed they found the ponies, sturdy little beasts of the kind loved by hobbits, not speedy but good for a long day's work. They mounted, and soon they were riding off into the mist, which seemed to open reluctantly before them and close forbiddingly behind them. After riding for about an hour, slowly and without talking, they saw the hedge looming suddenly ahead. It was tall and netted over with silver cobwebs.
So then they proceed. They come to this tunnel that the hobbits have dug underneath the hedge, and Fredegar says goodbye there on the surface. And then they all go down, the four remaining. They go down through the tunnel to where Mary unlocks the gate at the end, and they all pass through. I'll continue from there. So, "There," said Mary, "you have left the Shire and are now outside and on the edge of the old forest." "Are the stories about it true?" asked Pippin. "I don't know what stories you mean," Mary answered. "If you mean the old bogey stories Fatty's nurses used to tell him about goblins and wolves and things of that sort, I should say no. At any rate, I don't believe them. But the forest is queer. Everything in it is very much more alive, more aware of what is going on, so to speak, than things are in the Shire. And the trees do not like strangers. They watch you. They are usually content merely to watch you as long as daylight lasts and you don't do much. Occasionally the most unfriendly ones may drop a branch or stick a root out or grasp at you with a long trailer. But at night things can be most alarming, or so I am told. I have only once or twice been in here after dark, and then only near the hedge. I thought all the trees were whispering to each other, passing news and plots along in an unintelligible language, and the branches swayed and groped without any wind. They do say the trees do actually move and can surround strangers and hem them in. In fact, long ago they attacked the hedge. They came and planted themselves right by it and leaned over it. But the hobbits came and cut down hundreds of trees and made a great bonfire in the forest and burned all the ground in a long strip east of the hedge. After that, the trees gave up the attack, but they became very unfriendly. There is still a wide, bare space not far inside where the bonfire was made. So this is the first characterization that we get of the forest itself. Mark, what do you think of this?
One of the phrases that sticks out to me, and the trees do not like strangers. Um, I think the truth of the folks that live in the Shire, um, they they're strangers to it because there is a in some ways there's a lack of love for it. If you love the forest, you spend time in it, and you get to those experiences of its hardships become different when you sort of love it for itself. When you're in the forest, you do experience, weird, strange things, but it has a lot to do with who you are. I think in some ways, how you experience it. Trees do during temperature changes, trees will crack and pop, without just noises. There is this phenomenon they call sudden limb drop. It's an interesting thing that happens particularly when the humidity is just right. It's usually a windless day, so it's very unexpected. And a large lateral limb, large horizontal limb will pop and break and fall. very unexpectedly. A lot of folks want their trees cut down when they first experience something like this because they feel like the whole thing is just so unpredictable. There are some ways of predicting some of those things in our from what we know about trees, but it's still very unexpected. And so it has this the mystery of the forest, the it doesn't we don't speak its language,
Mm.
uh, we don't sort of listen intently like the Tom Bombadil character, and so it always seems kind of at odds, with the ease of life for us who walk on two legs,
Right.
hobbit or human. So yeah, I think Tolkien's actually experienced probably some of these things himself, just to make a journey through an old forest and to be snagged by it, to be, you're carrying your pack and you're constantly fighting all the snags. But I think how your heart is geared towards it will change the way you experience some of those things. And
Mm.
if you view a hedge as something uh, that you need to separate you from it, then of course you wouldn't want the forest encroaching upon that. uh, you know. Yeah, I think it just draws even the hobbits that you would see almost as one of his characters who you might think would be in concert with it. Even they, have this conflict with it. I have felt like he's trying to communicate something there. How few of us are sort of living with a love for these creatures. So yeah,
Right.
that's one of those things that stands out to me. I just imagine Tolkien walking himself on a very similar path and taking the hobbits through a path he himself has walked.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
Sure. And it's interesting because we tend to think of the hobbits as the good guys, the wholesome, they've got the right understanding of things. But a lot of times that's really a very superficial read because Tolkien says as many things that are really overtly critical of hobbits at large and even his heroes as he does the positive things. They're hidebound. We've fixated on this the last several episodes here, but uh, they're the sort of creatures that will live at the foot of a tower from which you could see the sea and never even think of going of climbing it. They are entirely consumed with their own affairs. And therefore, yeah, as you point out, they are strangers to anything else that doesn't fit in that tidy, orderly, controlled, and dominated world.
Yeah, I sometimes imagined he depicted hobbits very much like his own kinsmen, even the best of them.
Hmm.
But even still, in his best in some of his best kinsmen, he sees this conflict. That's, I guess, one of the things that comes to mind.
Yeah. And along with that, of course, then we have the role of the elves, especially the elves in relationship with the hobbits. And the thing about the elves is the elves don't clear cut forests. The elves talk to the trees. The elves learn their language. The elves will tend them and guide them. So the elves, when they meet with the elves in Three's Company in the third chapter, and they dine with them in this living cathedral of trees that the elves have been tending and caring for. Now the hobbits have a town that's just a couple miles away from that, and it's called Woodhall. But they don't remember why it's called Woodhall, but it's right next to this little piece of the forest that the elves have tended and cared for, so that the forest is both itself and is friendly with the elves and even their guests, perhaps. But not the old forest. The elves leave the old forest alone, it seems. Um,
Yeah.
the other thing that's striking that I have to say is, I've always said about myself, I grew up in a forest because I grew up in northern Arizona, which I believe is supposedly the largest ponderosa pine forest in the world. Um, but I knew very, very few old growth trees there. Now, I don't think pines are as long lived as other trees, but even so, I know that forest had been logged over severely. And most of the trees that I encountered were maybe, so large in diameter, maybe a couple feet at most. Um, and and that was an easy forest to walk through. There was very little undergrowth, and of course, it's high desert, and above 7,000 feet, so it's a different sort of thing. But I had quite the experience coming, thinking, oh, I know woods, I know how to deal with woods, I know how to travel through woods. I came to Michigan and Ohio, and I was 19 years old. Well, you might even remember the arboretum at that college. Um, and I thought, oh, I'll just go. I don't need a path. I'll go cross country. It took me 20 minutes to go 10 feet. And I was mortified. I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. I had no clue what I was doing. So yeah, totally different encounter of. I was a stranger to that forest.
Some of the, some, I think in a lot of ways, side subject, a lot of ways, the forests we see here, even, until you really get into Southwest Ohio, where we're, the state we're in, most of our forests are overgrown with invasives, and they're actually much harder to traverse than our small patches of old growth forest.
Hmm.
They're even harder, almost impossible. They're just a thicket of invasive plants. So yeah, I think there is some ease in an old growth forest. Still difficult, but you still find it sort of making you still have to cooperate with it. You're not just going to go the path you want. You're going to go a way it provides, even still.
Right.
So yeah,
And
yeah.
speaking of going the way they provide, I think we're going to hit that very soon. So let's move on. After this, we see the hobbits arrive at the bonfire glade. A dreary place, but it seemed a charming and cheerful garden after the close forest, is what Tolkien says about it. Now, there's no exit from the glade except for one clear path, which goes north, the direction they want to go. So they take it. And on this path, Tolkien says, they now went much quicker and with better heart, for it seemed to them that the forest had relented and was going to let them pass unhindered after all. This is only temporary. Mark, would you read this bit?
Sure. But after a while, the air began to get hot and stuffy. The trees grew close again on either side, and they could no longer see far ahead. Now stronger than ever, they felt again the ill will of the wood pressing on them. So silent was it that the fall of their ponies' hoofs, rustling on dead leaves and occasionally stumbling on hidden roots, seemed to thud in their ears. Frodo tried to sing a song to encourage them, but his voice sank to a murmur. O wanderers in the shadowed land, despair not, for though dark they stand, all woods there be must end at last, and see the open sun go past, the setting sun, the rising sun, the day's end or the day begun, for east or west all woods must fail. Fail? Even as he said the word, his voice faded into silence. The air seemed heavy, and the making of words wearisome. Just behind them, a large branch fell from an old overhanging tree with a crash into the path. The trees seemed to close in before them. They do not like all that about ending and failing, said Mary. I should not sing any more at present. Wait till we get to the edge, and then we'll turn and give them a rousing chorus.
So there's your limb fall, and it seems like the forest is drawing them more deeply into a trap than anything else. What are your thoughts on this part of their forest journey, Mark?
I remember reading it for the first time, and as a child, I was confused. Why in the world? Even with the mention of, some past conflicts the forest has had with other creatures. I still thought to myself, this seems like some sort of trap, and um, I came to think of it as the forest feeling these strangers, and the longer they spend in it, maybe perhaps the more malicious they intend to be.
Hmm.
Why are these strangers still here? Perhaps we need to protect ourselves. So I see it as sort of like a, you know, uh, uh, this to hem them in is to sort of strip them of their power, and to maintain this sort of dominance over them. That's sort of the way I the feeling I got. Perhaps the forest isn't set on completely, killing them off, but kind of like a power play. Nature does these little, nature does all these little power plays that sometimes you think, oh, I'm doomed, but it's really a warning.
Sure.
You know, several species have sort of a warning call, and you think, you might think it's the end for the prey in front of them, but it's really just a hey, back off. Several different creatures come to mind, but that's sort of like maybe the trees version of it.
And I had two thoughts kind of along with all of this. That the one thing, it's from what you've been saying and what I read in the book that you recommended, everything that Tolkien describes the forest as doing are things that forests actually do, but generally just at a slower pace than Tolkien depicts. So
Yeah,
effectively, he lets his forest act almost in within the same time frame as the hobbits, which all of a sudden then becomes very much more sinister. Um, but all of this is actually very real. The other thought is, it's appropriate for the forest to be defensive. The hobbits have transgressed the armistice line of the hedge. The forest is willing to, almost by force to accept that. Hobbits live on this side of the hedge, the forest is on this side, but now these hobbits are inside. They need to be scared. They need to be sent packing with stories of how dangerous the forest is. It's a matter of self preservation because we showed that picture of what the forest had once been. Now it doesn't have, it can't afford even a small loss, perhaps. So it makes sense. Um,
yeah.
I like what you'd said about paths, though. How drastically forests will change. Maybe you could develop that a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah. You don't typically find you find a few paths in forests, and typically they're generated by large fallen logs, and the way that water travels, and it tends to benefit the current stand, of forest. Like it kind of, um, uh, what is there because of even the way that the ground is. The best way to travel an old forest is, to be a chipmunk. You can just run along the logs. Most of their paths are actually trees themselves. You do see changes. There are weather changes. There are that can create paths. But there are some old stories of Native American paths in particularly areas like in the Boundary Waters, where natives would portage canoes from place to place. And one of the things they found is that many of those paths were not uh, they were incredibly difficult to the modern traveler, and so they changed them. So there was a big, some ecologists were kind of against this in the establishment of some of these parks in these areas, and these preservation of these areas. In order to, do we keep the old paths? Do we allow these modern paths, which take sort of this striking, easy, flat leveled path through these places to portage from one lake area with a canoe or kayak to the next? And one ecologist who regularly visited and took the old paths found the experience very different. Um, the experience of taking these old paths, you could see that the person taking it was in complete concert with the forest, because it always allowed them to fish for like fresh fish.
Oh,
They were there. You could see that they would be there longer. It wasn't a fast journey. They were portaging from place to place, but they kept themselves near water. It was a little harder to carry a canoe, but the scenery was different. It was strikingly beautiful. You were kind of taken to these little beautiful little alcoves that maybe not easy to get to. So I found that to be interesting, because I sometimes view um, some of this, the early peoples of this country having a little bit more of a Tom Bombadil experience with their forests. Now they certainly changed them, and they certainly did cultivate them some, but their path making was very different, especially in those portages areas. I've been fascinated by that. So just to kind of see like what does the person who's sort of living in harmony with the forest, how do they travel versus kind of the modern man
Right.
who's really just trying to get from one place to the next.
And you make me think of the experience of like walking through a crowd of people. And if you're walking through a crowd of people, you're not going, there's going to be a knot of people that, tight in conversation, and you're going to go around that.
Mm,
Um, but modern man doesn't view the forests as living creatures, but just as things. So we'll chop right through, whatever we want to chop through without any attention. Uh, and we miss, well, we literally miss the forest for the trees in
yes.
the course of
Yes.
doing so. Huh. Let's move on with Tolkien's journey through the forest, though. So after this, they find the path leading them up a hill, from which they're able to see the whole forest laid out beneath them. It's about at this point that the trap begins to close upon them. So at length they made up their minds to go on again. The path that had brought them to the hill reappeared on the northward side, but they had not followed it far before they became aware that it was bending steadily to the right. Soon it began to descend rapidly, and they guessed that it must actually be heading towards the Withywindle Valley. Not at all the direction they wished to take. After some discussion, they decided to leave this misleading path and strike northward, for although they had not been able to see it from the hilltop, the road must lie that way, and it could not be many miles off. I'm actually going to share the a little bit of the map while I'm reading this. Also northward and to the left of the path, the land seemed to be drier and more open, climbing up to slopes where the trees were thinner, and pines and firs replaced the oaks and ashes and other strange and nameless trees of the denser wood. At first their choice seemed to be good. They got along at a fair speed, though whenever they got a glimpse of the sun in an open glade they seemed unaccountably to have veered eastwards. But after a time the trees began to close in again, just where they had appeared from a distance to be thinner and less tangled. Then deep folds in the ground were discovered unexpectedly, like the ruts of great giant wheels or wide moats and sunken roads, long disused and choked with brambles. These lay usually right across their line of march, and could only be crossed by scrambling down and out again, which was troublesome and difficult with their ponies. Each time they climbed down they found the hollow filled with thick bushes and matted undergrowth, which somehow would not yield to the left, but only gave way when they turned to the right, and they had to go some distance along the bottom before they could find a way up the further bank. Each time they clambered out, the trees seemed deeper and darker, and always to the left and upwards it was most difficult to find a way, and they were forced to the right and downwards. After an hour or two they had lost all clear sense of direction, though they knew well enough that they had long ceased to go northward at all. They were being headed off, and were simply following a course chosen for them, eastwards and southwards, into the heart of the forest, and not out of it.
I'll continue reading.
Perfect.
The afternoon was wearing away when they scrambled and stumbled into a fold that was wider and deeper than any they had yet met. It was so steep and overhung that it proved impossible to climb out of it again, either forwards or backwards, without leaving their ponies and their baggage behind. All they could do was to follow the fold, downwards. The ground grew soft and in places boggy. Springs appeared in the banks, and soon they found themselves following a brook that trickled and babbled through a weedy bed. Then the ground began to fall rapidly, and the brook, growing strong and noisy, flowed and leaped swiftly downhill. They were in a deep, dim-lit gully, overarched by trees high above them. After stumbling along for some way along the stream, they came to quite suddenly out of the gloom. As if through a gate, they saw the sunlight before them. Coming to the opening, they found that they had made their way down through a cleft in a high, steep bank, almost a cliff. At its feet was a wide space of grass and reeds, and in the distance could be glimpsed another bank almost as steep. A golden afternoon of late sunshine lay warm and drowsy upon the hidden land between. In the midst of it there wound lazily a dark river of brown water, bordered with ancient willows, arched over with willows, blocked with fallen willows, and flecked with thousands of faded willow leaves. The air was thick with them, fluttering yellow from the branches, for there was a warm and gentle breeze blowing softly in the valley, and the reeds were rustling, and the willow boughs were creaking. "Well, now, I have at least some notion of where we are," said Mary. "We have come almost in the opposite direction to which we intended. This is the river Withywindle. We'll go on and explore. I will go on and explore."
And still it seems, with all of this, the hobbits don't perceive any will in all this, or perhaps they are avoiding perceiving a malevolent will in this, even as they have been drawn in exactly the opposite direction from what they had intended, and are exactly where they do not want to be. The other thing I have to note is, unless I missed it, the part that I read gives us the first detailed information about what sort of trees comprise this forest. And I'm actually curious, Mark, what your thoughts are about these characterizations, with ashes and oaks being described as somewhat more sinister than pines and firs. And then, of course, there's the overt, unavoidable emphasis on the overwhelming willowness of the Withywindle River Valley. So I know I feel this way about deciduous trees in general, and probably willows in particular, with my noted experience of ponderosa pines and young growth at that. But I know my take might well be subjective. What do you think about this passage in general and about the characterization specifically, Mark?
Yeah, I think if you were to use as a clue something's outer organization, you could maybe guess at if the outer look of something says something about the inner intention of something. The deciduous trees like oaks, ashes, and even willows. They have, from the exterior look of them, they seem very symmetrical, from the way that, if they're in full sunlight and they're just a single tree. But in most forests, they take on whatever growth the light allows.
Hmm.
And so little breaks in the light will cause odd, almost misshapen growths because of the benefit of light in a given area. Tree will respond to
Mm-hmm.
that. And particularly if it's like a deciduous tree, oaks, ashes, willows, uh, they don't have the benefit of gaining photosynthesis, for example, at least not nearly as much, in the winter as during the summer. So it's very important for them to respond, and so there's lots of low creeping, sort of unsymmetrical. Almost, a little bit of a disorganized look to them. When you um, evergreen trees of the nature like of pines, spruces, hemlocks, those things. They're very organized. Even their needles are organized in very symmetrical patterns. Sometimes most of the time branches are organized. I mean, not hemlocks, but pines and spruce and fir. They're organized in tiers. The branches grow at certain
Mm-hmm.
distances from the ones below.
Right.
So they seem organized. They seem almost more at peace with. They kind of grow. They kind of grow the same in all places, even with or without light. If they have enough light, they'll grow very symmetrical almost all the time. Um, so they don't have as much. In some ways, they don't have as much diversity in growth habit. So I just imagine if you were going to use the sort of the exterior look of a tree and imagine one as being more sinister than the other, I definitely would follow that characteristic. Um, you know, you if you get hit with you rarely get hit with a pine or a spruce branch because they're usually dense and you can't really enter into them. Whereas like there are these big open spaces to wander within deciduous trees and get knocked around a bit. I think it too is, again, you get this probably this experience Tolkien himself had,
Mm-hmm.
um, using his imagination and just being in the forest and kind of personifying things. It makes total sense to me. Yeah.
Right. It's interesting you describe pines in that way because, yeah, that was my experience too, growing up climbing them. They're basically like a ladder going up into the sky. You get pitch on your hands, but it's easy. Um, yeah. How about the rest of this, with the forest turning against them and just forcing them, in this particular direction?
Yeah, when I reread it, as a child, I just sort of sat bewildered by it. When I reread it, I think to myself, perhaps someone who wasn't such a stranger to the forest would have found a better way, would have found a way to cooperate with it, sort of, being more present with, uh, with, uh, the forest. At least it's just sort of like my wondering about what he's trying to communicate. Maybe there was a better way.
Sure.
Who knows? There's always something you can draw from. Uh, you know, Thinking back to what is God's will. Or are we in the right place? Something good can be made of. Perhaps coming out two different sides of the forest. We'll never know. They don't do that. So
Right. And yeah, they follow Mary's lead, and Mary is confident that he can do this. He's been in before, no big deal. A little bit, maybe even of showing off. This is my home turf. I grew up right next to here. This is no big deal. They don't approach it with a particular caution or respect. And they're singing songs about how the trees will fail, and it's like, okay, well, that's they're treating it as just an object, a set of entities, not living creatures either. So
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, their unawareness of its that it might be up to something, perhaps is in concert with them being completely led astray.
Maybe so. They're easy to lead astray. They see the path leading out of the glade in the direction they want to go, and they're like, "Cool, easy. The forest loves us now." Like, there was a mouth, and you just walked in. Oh well. All right. Let's move on here. Uh, so Mary, once they've reached the river, he looks ahead and he finds a path, and they begin to follow it. As we said, the goal is just to get out. So they're going, I think, up the river, uh, towards the edge of the forest. But very quickly we see the Willows, and one particular Willow with a capital W, in action. So why don't
Mm,
you start with this bit, and then I'll take over halfway through so you can comment first.
sure. The hobbits began to feel very hot. There were armies of flies of all kinds buzzing round their ears, and the afternoon sun was burning on their backs. At last they came suddenly into a thin shade. Great gray branches reached across the path. Each step forward became more reluctant than the last. Sleepiness seemed to be creeping out of the ground and up their legs and falling softly out of the air upon their heads and eyes. Frodo felt his chin go down and his head nod. Just in front of him, Pippin fell forward onto his knees. Frodo halted. "It's no good," he heard Merry saying. "Can't go another step without rest. Must have nap. It's cool under the willows. Less flies." Frodo did not like the sound of this. "Come on," he cried. "We can't have a nap yet. We must get clear of the forest first." But the others were too far gone to care. Beside them, Sam stood yawning and blinking stupidly. Suddenly Frodo himself felt sleep overwhelming him. His head swam. There now seemed hardly a sound in the air. The flies had stopped buzzing, only a gentle noise on the edge of hearing, a soft fluttering of a song, half whispered, seemed to stir in the boughs above. He lifted his heavy eyes and saw leaning over him a huge willow tree, old and hoary. Enormous it looked, its sprawling branches going up like reaching arms with many long fingered hands, its knotted and twisted trunk gaping in wide fissures that creaked faintly as the boughs moved. The leaves fluttering against the bright sky dazzled him, and he toppled over, lying where he fell upon the grass. Merry and Pippin dragged themselves forward and lay down with their backs to the willow trunk. Behind them, the great cracks gaped wide to receive them as the tree swayed and creaked. They looked up at the gray and yellow leaves moving softly against the light and singing. They shut their eyes, and then it seemed that they could almost hear words, cool words, saying something about water and sleep. They gave themselves up to the spell and fell fast asleep at the foot of the great gray willow.
And I'll continue. Frodo lay for a while fighting with the sleep that was overpowering him. Then, with an effort, he struggled to his feet again. He felt a compelling desire for cool water. "Wait for me, Sam," he stammered. Must bathe feet a minute. Half in a dream, he wandered forward to the riverward side of the tree, where great winding roots grew out into the stream like gnarled dragonets straining down to drink. He straddled one of these and paddled his hot feet in the cool brown water, and there he too suddenly fell asleep with his back against the tree. Sam sat down and scratched his head and yawned like a cavern. He was worried. The afternoon was getting late, and he thought this sudden sleepiness uncanny. "There's more behind this than sun and warm air," he muttered to himself. "I don't like this great big tree. I don't trust it. Hark at it singing about sleep now. This won't do at all." He pulled himself to his feet and staggered off to see what had become of the ponies. He found that two had wandered on a good way along the path, and he had just caught them and brought them back towards the others when he heard two noises, one loud and the other soft but very clear. One was the splash of something heavy falling into the water, the other was a noise like the snick of a lock when a door quietly closes fast. And then, of course, Sam finds Frodo has been dropped into the water by the Willow, and he rescues him, and then the two of them find that the Great Willow has effectively eaten Merry and Pippin. But before we talk about all that and the rescue, what are your thoughts on this sleepy and soporific scene, Mark?
I think a lot about some of the even some of the I guess more recent research on trees. Um, there were several studies done, and I think you probably touched on this a little bit in Peter Wollobin's book, um, in trying to figure out whether or not trees, um, how and if they communicate. Because some of these research see these patterns of things happening in forests where they're kind of doing some things at the same time. Why is it that all these trees are producing like their fruit and nuts at the same time? And then these trees that are sort of cut off from this other forest, why are they not doing it?
Hmm.
It's not something that's just happening in terms of some like mechanical life cycle, but there's actually something between the trees causing this to happen. And there has been research to show that that trees have pheromone responses when an invasive species shows up in a forest. They see this with out west. They see it with the pine bark beetle, for example. This is an invasive creature that starts feeding on these trees, and the trees do produce defense mechanisms that we can't see, that warn the other trees of this coming, and they produce more of these. I think they're tannins, these sort of bitter things that sort of make themselves. They all sort of become bitter,
Mm-hmm.
at the entrance of the introduction of this feeding that's being done. And so, there's a lot of research about things like that. So what comes to my mind is this sort of like forest response to maybe these creatures that don't seem to be friendly. Maybe they're not attacking anything at the moment, but maybe there's this long memory that the trees have of other similar creatures. That it comes to mind. It just seems so very interesting to me that Tolkien, not sitting with any of this research in front of him, kind of imagines that maybe there's a defense response or a defense that the forest has, and maybe that's what all this like entrapment is kind of about. To like maybe we localize trees themselves will localize wounds. They don't really heal. That when something invades them, they sort of surround it and they uh, enclose it within themselves. Sometimes too. Uh, and so it's just interesting that what I see in trees' behavior and all the things we've studied, while like you say, it's sort of this fast forward, um, you know, even the idea that they would become sleepy and that the trees might have something to do with it. Um, there are things that are pushed out into the environment around trees when they're being threatened. And so I just find it interesting
It's
that
fascinating, right?
these little tidbits in there that I, of course, never would have kind of thought about in my, as a child reading it. But
Right.
yeah, that's I think how an arborist would start to like it would trigger a lot of those things, those thoughts about some of the research they've done with tree communication. But
On that subject, what about the description of the willow itself? Is that a healthy willow tree?
most of the time with The interesting thing about a lot of old trees can be in good health, but still kind of gnarled and affected by so many things. A lot of really old tree species are hollow.
Hmm.
But not necessarily unhealthy.
Hmm.
They've lost their taproot, and that taproot's kind of died off, and fungal stuff has kind of worked at the center of the tree, but the tree is stable and healthy, but it kind of becomes this whole other ecosystem. Its roots continue to expand. I just imagine a very, very old tree with lots of hollow points in it, that you can take shelter sometimes in in old trees and old growth forests that have been hollowed out. You can basically build a little camp sometimes inside some of if you're out in the Pacific Northwest, 4 or 5 people can just sleep inside of a tree. And there's even some of those old. You can even find some big trees like that, um, in probably both in Europe and the United States, but they're hard to find now. You know, but yeah, I think it's interesting. He plays on both, the experience of the old forest, but also there's this sort of imagining that they other things that could happen if you had an invasive uh, threat.
Invasive species like a hobbit. Hobbits are an invasive species to what had been the great forest and now is the old forest. So far, that is our takeaway. But meanwhile, we left Merry and Pippin trapped inside the willow, and Frodo and Sam trying to figure out how to rescue them. So first they try to pry the wood open, but that's useless. And then they think of an axe, but as a point in their favor, invasive species though they are, they haven't got one. They only brought a hatchet. But then they think of fire. So would you read this bit, Mark, and then tell us what you think of it?
Yeah. Quickly they gathered dry grass and leaves and bits of bark and made a pile of broken twigs and chopped sticks. These they heaped up against the trunk on the far side of the tree from the prisoners. As soon as Sam had struck a spark into the tinder, it kindled the dry grass, and a flurry of flame and smoke went up. Twigs crackled. Little fingers of fire licked against the dry, scorched rind of the ancient tree and scorched it. A tremor ran through the whole willow. The leaves seemed to hiss above their heads with a sound of pain and anger. A loud scream came from Mary, and from far inside the tree they heard Pippin give a muffled yell. Put it out, cried Mary. He'll squeeze me in two. If you don't, he says so. Who? What? Shouted Frodo, rushing round to the other side of the tree. Put it out, begged Mary. The branches of the willow began to sway violently. There was a sound as of a wind rising and spreading outwards to the branches of all the other trees around about, as though they had dropped a stone into the quiet slumber of the river valley and set up ripples of anger that ran out over the whole forest. Sam kicked at the little fire and stamped out the sparks. But Frodo, without any clear idea of why he did so, or what he hoped for, ran along the path crying, "Help, help, help!" It seemed to him that he could hardly hear the sound of his own shrill voice. It was blown away from him by the willow wind and drowned in a clamor of leaves. As soon as the words left his mouth, he felt desperate, lost, and witless. Suddenly he stopped. There was an answer, or so he thought, but it seemed to come from behind him. Away down the path, further back in the forest, he turned round and listened, and soon there could be no doubt. Someone was singing a song. A deep, glad voice was singing carelessly and happily, but it was singing nonsense. Hey do, Mary do, ring a dong dillo, ring a dong ho along, fall a la the willow, Tom bomb, jolly Tom, Tom bombadillo.
Okay. So what do you think of this? I mean, this is a lot happens in a very short amount of time here.
I think they pull on their own, you know, what are our weapons against trees? You know? Uh, what do we have against them? We need a blade or we need fire. They're too strong, they're too big. We're too weak. You can't really push or shove, a tree. I love the description of uh, the tree itself isn't it's not just an individual they seem to be harming. They've set off a reaction, the whole wide space around them. They haven't offended one thing. They've introduced sort of a great evil in the place, fire and sword
Right.
to a forest. Um, yeah, yeah.
And it's like an immune system that is ready to get rid of them as they're threatening it. So it's really interesting seeing again sped up that interaction between the woods and the trees and the hobbits. I keep saying sped up, but maybe that's not even correct. Just uh, in this context, the trees have time to fight back.
It's probably the only way you could depict, I guess you almost have to kind of speed it up to depict, what, yeah, and maybe you're right. Maybe it's not speeding it up, but like making it visible, what it would do if it had the ability to move a little bit quicker.
Right. Because that's what trees do. I mean, they grow around things. Up in Michigan, my in-laws, in their neighborhood, there's a tree that's, in the process of just growing around a chain link fence that was hemming it in. It's totally a thing that would be done. Just not quite as quickly as open up here, have a nice bed, and close. Now you live inside the tree. Uh,
Yeah,
but
it's a yeah, the cells, there's like some um, cell differentiation where like the response to a wound, especially one that continues to press upon it, it will create growth around, as opposed to just being wounded and doing nothing.
right.
It's kind of just taking it, it grows to consume it.
Because it's a living
So
thing, not well, it's a living creature, not a thing, I should say. Yeah. So then, of course, Tom Bombadil comes by, just hello, and they explain their plight, and he responds very quickly. And as we said, all of this happens in no more than a page and a half. So I'll read this bit. What? Shouted Tom Bombadil, leaping up in the air. Old Man Willow? Not worse than that, eh? That can soon be mended. I know the tune for him, old grey willow man. I'll freeze his marrow cold if he don't behave himself. I'll sing his roots off. I'll sing a wind up and blow leaf and branch away. Old Man Willow. Setting down his lilies carefully on the grass, he ran to the tree. There he saw Mary's feet still sticking out. The rest had already been drawn further inside. Tom put his mouth to the crack and began singing into it in a low voice. They could not catch the words, but evidently Mary was aroused. His legs began to kick. Tom sprang away and, breaking off a hanging branch, smote the side of the willow with it. You let them out again, old man Willow, he said. What be you a-thinking of? You should not be waking. Eat earth, dig deep, drink water, go to sleep. Bombadil is talking. He then seized Mary's feet and drew him out of the suddenly widening crack. There was a tearing creak, and the other crack split open, and out of it Pippin sprang as if he had been kicked. Then with a loud snap both cracks closed fast again. A shudder ran through the tree from root to tip, and complete silence fell. Thank you, said the hobbits, one after the other. Tom Bombadil burst out laughing. Well, my little fellows, said he, stooping so that he peered into their faces, you shall come home with me. The table is all laden with yellow cream, honeycomb, and white bread and butter. Goldberry is waiting. Time enough for questions around the supper table. You follow after me as quick as you are able. With that he picked up his lilies, and then with a beckoning wave of his hand went hopping and dancing along the path eastward, still singing loudly and nonsensically. So, uh, so of course this is our first meeting with Tom Bombadil, and Mark, I'm going to be spending the next 3 episodes talking about Tom with other people, but I'm glad and happy that you get the first crack at thoughts about him and what he does here with the willow and the forest and his character in general.
I think, I don't see Tom in this instance. Maybe I see him differently than others, but I don't see him as speaking. I still think he sort of speaks for the forest, and he sort of arrives on this scene like, okay, everybody's kind of overreacting here. Um, here's what we really need to do. Everybody shape up. You almost have this like you almost have this the sense that this tree, while it is connected to everything around it, may be kind of overreacting. And so he, at least that's sort of the sense I get. Perhaps we don't need to be rid of these fellows. They're actually pretty innocent, though though they resemble their, though they resemble a known enemy, these guys are fine.
Right.
We're getting ahead of ourselves here. It just seems like he kind of comes in and cools the situation, and I
Right.
don't see him as speaking as somebody not in concert with the forest, but the forest itself. Like, yeah, yeah, yeah. Now that let's take counsel here, and yeah, these guys are okay.
Right. He can hit the tree because it can take it. He knows it's not going to hurt the tree, and I like what you're saying. He says, "Eat earth, not hobbit."
Yeah, yeah,
Drink deep, drink water, go to sleep. He's like, you have everything you need. You do not need to fight with these hobbits. They're leaving. Bombadil is talking. I've got things under control. Take a chill pill, old man Willow.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's sort of like this grumpy old Willow is going to kind of have his way, and he shows up and says, "No, no, this isn't the will of the forest."
Right.
That's sort of the feeling I get.
I
You
like
know,
that. Tom as the defender, even of Old Man Willow, because it's true. He doesn't harm the Willow. He just makes the Willow let them go. Huh.
Yeah, I felt his threats even as a kid. I felt his threats were pretty, more to get the attention than to actually. He doesn't strike you as the as simply. He doesn't play the character of, I have control of the forest and I will do what I want. He's like, everybody behave.
Right. Like a
That's the
parent
sense I
coming in
get.
and telling, children, stop fighting already. There's room enough for you all.
Yeah, he speaks both languages, so you need some sort of ambassador here in the midst of this thing that's been slowly drawing to a head,
Right.
and it's about to get really, really violent. Um,
He's sort of speaking in the
someone gets
voice
hurt.
of a parent, riding in the front seat of a van with a teenager sitting next to a toddler in a car. Because that's an experience I think we both have had, within the last week or two, and like, okay, just everybody calm down. I like that. It's a different read that I've had of Bombadil here, but I like that very much. Anything else about Tom Bombadil, more broadly?
Yeah, I think I'll sit on that for a minute. Yeah.
Very good. I guess I want to just observe a couple things, and maybe I'll say this. There are a few things that are striking about Tom Bombadil as he shows up. The first is that everything he does, he sings,
Mhm.
which is interesting, and even everything he says is kind of in this sing-song meter. It all could be a song. He never really talks normally. The second thing that's striking about Tom is he's, as we'll see next time, he's a master of everything, but he dominates nothing.
Mhm.
He lives very lightly in the forest. The third thing about him is he barely says a sentence without talking about Goldberry. He's very oriented toward his wife,
Mhm.
and that's it's striking. Uh, I'm not quite sure what it means, but it's striking. And then he's very hospitable. He brings them in and provides them with nourishment, even though he only just met them. He takes responsibility. He cares for them, and gives them a respite, gives them peace and protection. And yet he lives here in the old forest, not with the elves in Rivendell, not in the Shire. He lives in the old forest. So there's a lot that's perplexing about him. And yet, I think I really like your broad, conclusion. He's functioning as the spirit of the forest, the voice of the forest. He defends them. He speaks for them. I think there may be more going on here, but it certainly is a great place to begin. Anything else you'd want to add, or disagree with me on?
I remember thinking, even in my first read, that perhaps when the meeting of Tom Bombadil would stay with them forever, and it would change view of the forest. I think he I think Tolkien wants Bombadil to change how we see the forest, and I think he uses that, and even with the hobbits to the next time you visit, remember Tom Bombadil. How can you not,
Right.
right? How can you not? The forest isn't. It's not all bad. There's Tom Bombadil there. Remember him. There's a place of quiet rest in this seemingly untamed area. And there is Tom Bombadil in the midst of it.
Right. Maybe you don't have to tame and master a thing to find peace and rest in it. I also wonder to what degree, and I know I'll talk about this more in the future, but I know Tolkien's perspective on the forests in general kind of developed, and I know that not least because in his original sketch of the plot, Treebeard was supposed to be an evil entity, a bad giant, and he kind of almost required by the way the plot developed. Treebeard becomes instead the character that we know, the shepherd of the trees, who speaks, even more eloquently than Bombadil for them and for their protection, and grieves the death of so much of the forest. But I wonder if he doesn't start himself on the path toward that insight, with this scene.
I think for Tolkien, the forest has every right to have like turned to the dark side.
Yes.
It has sort of like you've from what has been done, you have every right to feel this way. But perhaps even the oldest, uh, most abused. The older you are as a forest creature with seeing abuse, probably the harder you could become. The if you let it, allow it. So I do like that. I do very much appreciate that Treebeard has the um, you know uh, plays more of a hero sort of role. Because I think that for all of us created things, we have to make a choice with the evils done to us. We have to decide what to do with that.
Right. To respond with violence or to find a different path. I like that.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. They have the most to lose in some ways,
right.
that you sort of feel that they've got everything to lose and that they're going to lose everything,
Mm,
um, you know, in some ways.
right.
At multiple points, you kind of feel that.
Right.
I think Tolkien feels that for even just in his own world. He kind of feels that we all have so much to lose if we lose this rich gift that we've been given.
Right.
Um,
The other thing that crosses my mind here, and I had already been intending, but now especially I want to, when we come to that encounter with Treebeard, I'd love to have you back again uh, in a few years or whenever that happens to be. Because there we kind of see Merry and Pippin with their second encounter with an old growth forest. And they do a lot better the second time than the first time. They actually manage to make friends with it without needing Tom Bombadil there. But anyway, with that, I think we should wrap up the chapter. We haven't actually arrived yet at Tom Bombadil's, but I know my next guest is going to want to come back and start here anyway, so we'll leave the hobbits on the path, following Tom for the present. I'll only throw out maybe a little bit of a thought that Tom is literally going and preparing a place for them right now. I'm not going to draw a conclusion from that, but I think that that's striking. Anyway, thank you, Mark. So, now we come to Act 4. Now, this is a Tolkien podcast, and along with podcasts, it seems there is a further proliferation of Tolkien-based or Tolkien-related media every year. Some of that is better, and some of that is worse, but for us, the books and the things that Tolkien writes are always paramount, and it's a treat to hear how people interpret reading them out loud. So, for this segment, we usually ask our guest to pick a favorite passage from Tolkien's writings and read it to us. But Mark, I think you have something a little bit different to share instead. If I understood right, you're going to start with something from Tolkien himself, and then you're going to continue with some other voices that really aren't heard much in the modern day, but that seem to be speaking from something of the same place as Tolkien was himself. So I'll let you explain what you've got for us, and I'm looking forward to hearing it.
It was a quote from Treebeard that I found that kind of led me into a string of thoughts, about Tolkien and the forest. And I have a few other authors I read that I wanted to touch on and get your thoughts on, Father.
Oh, beautiful.
I wish I could give like a chapter and verse, so to speak, or page number for this quote, but I remembered it and I was just trying to find it really quick. Treebird says in conversation, I am not altogether on anybody's side
Hmm.
because nobody is altogether on my side. If you understand me, nobody cares for the woods as I care for them, not even elves nowadays.
Ooh.
And I think the uh, Tolkien, I think in this description, um, I almost imagine him saying it himself. I feel as if Tolkien he draws these he sort of draws this parallel, and you see it in another response that Treebeard has. I think he's speaking about Saruman, how he thinks only in wheels and gears or something like that. There's this sort of industrial progressive mind, and why is there's this sense that it's most at conflict with uh, the forest, and that's going to affect everything. Why does the evil character have this violence against the forest? And I think too, Tolkien probably feels alone in saying this, because I get that sense from other um, uh, writers of ecology who spend time, in uh, sort of trying to save, kind of these last vestiges of these old paths and these old forests. And so I was going to read a couple little things that spirit of the sense of loss of this great gift, and how it seems to be kind of tied to this constant push towards this progressive push towards, perhaps you could even say, against the fear of death. You get this sense even in some of these ecological minded writers. The first one I was going to read, it's in a book called Forest Life by George Washington Sears.
Very good.
Uh, he spends a lot of time in the forest, and I think this was written in 1880, so much has changed since then, obviously. But he sits in the forest and writes poetry, and one of the things he says is, for brick and mortar breed filth and crime, and a pulse of evil that throbs and beats, and men are withered before their prime by the curse paved in with lanes and streets, and lungs are smothered and shoulders bowed in the poisonous reek of mill and mine, and death stalks in on the struggling crowd, but he shuns the shadow of fir and pine. It just has this little bit of um, it kind of makes you think he's perhaps singing of the Saruman,
Right.
I will build this factory of war.
Sure.
And how am I going to do that? I'm going to do it with the forest. I'm not going to sit in its shade. It's this commodity, this weapon of instead of something to be appreciated. Um,
Right.
um,
And I could well believe that quote, could have been written by Tolkien. Yeah, or Treebeard.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's that description of this sort of this fast moving machine. Um, and I think and the other little section I was going to read. It's a description of the loss of a single animal. Um, and it's in Escondida, Arizona, and he's describing the progression of the pioneers moving west, and uh, everyone's got cattle around this little mountain, and there's this one bear that's kind of terrorizing people. There's stories about it. They've kind of killed off everything else, but there's this one last remaining bear, and it just had this sense to me when I was reading his his words on it. It took me back to Tolkien. What would it mean for him, if you were to do away with the last bear on this mountain, Um, and so he starts this description as he tells the long story of the many efforts to get rid of this bear, and he says, "It was only after we pondered on these things, because he himself was in this area. People were kind of asking about, hey, you guys should join in and try to help us get rid of this bear.
Mm.
It was only after we pondered on these things that we began to wonder who wrote the rules for progress. Since the beginning of time had gnawed at the basaltic hulk of Escudilla, that's the mountain where this bear resides, wasting, waiting, and building, time built three things on the old mountain: a venerable aspect, a community of minor animals and plants, and a grizzly. The government trapper who took the grizzly knew he had made Escudilla safe for all the cows. He did not know he had toppled the spire of an edifice, a building since the morning stars sang together." And so I just saw in his last little description, um, like the care for something small that had no voice, you know, this sort of terrifying creature, which, perhaps even the forest can be sort of like a bear, very inconvenient for everyone that's there, but perhaps it had value that, like, it had been done away with before that value had been fully recognized. Um, I have always felt, as an arborist reading through Tolkien again, that he feels those things, that he sat in the woods like these other people, maybe with different presuppositions about the world and its creator, but a shared sense of loss, even for something that might threaten him. Perhaps this thing that did threaten us, like he realized we lost something great in this one last creature. And so, anyway, I guess where I was going with all of this is I find it to be a little bit worrisome in much of Christian thought that we be really careful not to um, make things and take creation and make it into a commodity, and um, uh, I think it becomes it gets into our culture very easily to always kind of make that straight path, to always sort of whatever might make our lives a little bit easier. And I think sometimes, like, there ought to be a love for and a care for um, creation around us. And I feel like it's so lost in so many parts of Christianity that I felt like it would do a great service to some of the subtle things that Tolkien is trying to say. Even he's got a much bigger story, but I feel like there is something in his heart that, if I could be a part of communicating that, um, even in these distant writers uh, who probably aren't even acquainted with Tolkien. One of them was before his time, so. Um, yeah, so I find, I wanted to kinda get your thoughts on that, I guess.
Well, I love both of those voices that you bring in because yeah, Tolkien is not isolated from the world that he lives in. Very much the contrary. What he's writing comes out of a reaction, effectively, to I guess we could say, painting with a very broad brush, and a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and the accelerating exploitation of natural resources and destruction of the natural landscape of the England of his childhood for the sake of efficiency and productivity. That straight path to something that that loses so much. So yeah, both of those voices, I think they would fit in perfectly well with Tolkien, and everything. Yeah, he wrote stories that were very similar, to that, um, if not identical in both cases. Um, and more broadly, yeah, for us as human beings, part of why, okay, I'm an Orthodox Christian priest, you're an Orthodox Christian arborist. We read, we read these stories, and then we try to go about our daily lives in a way that is hopefully, God willing, a little bit more attentive to the whole creation in which we live. Not just trying to bend it to our will, uh, but to to have some respect for the way in which it functions. And we see that this is appropriate, the way that the saints exist, in relationship with the natural world. Okay, they're not killing the bears to make the wilderness safe for a monastery, or maybe some of them are, but Saint Seraphim, he befriends the bear. There's the desert monastic that needs to cross a river and prays, and the Lord sends crocodiles to carry him across. If I'm not misremembering the story, there are the saints who won't kill an ant or a spider. Who, to live more conscious of the reality of life that that surrounds us, instead of seeing everything as just a thing to be objectified. And ultimately, we begin this path by not viewing ourselves as an object. The reason that we keep a fast, the reason that we struggle for chastity, and self restraint with so many bodily desires, is to acknowledge that we are more than just objects, uh, to be treated as, to be sated with the quickest path, that there's more going on. I think I'm mixing my themes, but yeah, everything you're saying is exactly why I think we love Tolkien, because he gives a voice to these sorts of things that don't fit easily in the world that we've made for ourselves here, but that we need these things to be able to continue to live, for our children to have a world to live in, a world that is worth living in.
Yeah. Yeah, and I thought, when you had asked me, what do you want to do next on the podcast? And I thought, could I pick my favorite passage, or what if I could say something else? And I thought, just just putting a pin on that,
Mm.
there are certainly better voices than mine on it, but just you know, kind of putting a bookmark in that thought that strikes me so deeply. Just that he combines those two aspects of this sort of this coming evil, and why does that have to be? In so many stories, the coming evil has nothing to do with with a conflict with a forest. He does that, and there may be other stories that also do that, but to me it stands out, how it's tied, how those two things are tied. And I think certainly that movement in our own society is still there. And so I think there's so many important themes, I think, in the book, probably. As far as anything I can say, that would be where, that would be one of the themes that just strikes me deeply. So yeah.
Right. And, I know it's important to Tolkien, not least because effectively he makes the elves function as a voice for the natural world. Uh, speaking for it, even as they are passing away, because there's no room for them in the faster paced world of men. Anyway, uh, these are themes that we've been talking about, and that I know we will keep on talking about as long as I'm doing this podcast, because they're central to who Tolkien is and what he's dealing with. So
Yeah, and it's complicated. I grew up in a different sort of, a different sort of Christian, uh, perspective of the world and of Christ's incarnation and all of these things, and, um, you know, we have to, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, we we oftentimes we can too easily see we can make the world into some sort of commodity if all of our spirituality is just based on getting out of here. A
yes,
sort of aversion to um, an aversion to this place in such a way that we forget that we were put here as gardeners. Yeah, I guess that's one um, thought that I had because so much of my um, evangelical upbringing, I almost saw no value in it. I
right,
guess I didn't see any spiritual connection to care for creation other than, don't be mean,
right,
don't be cruel, but yeah, and I think Tolkien, his understanding, um, he kind of places the I think he places what it means to be a human, what it means, what God intends for us in terms of to be like him is, he created all these things, they were good. We have a tendency to be in conflict with it because of, we can be, I think we don't want to be strangers to it,
right.
to that for it. So
A lot of the things you're saying, they remind me of a different writer, and I'm wondering, have you read G.K. Chesterton's Ballad of the White Horse?
I've read G.K. Chesterton, but not that.
So
So
I'm going to
I would
read two passages. One of them is describing the Vikings, and the other is King Alfred. Speaking of uh, of the Christian approach, because these both of these relate, and I think you would actually really appreciate this. So I'll just recommend it. But he's speaking about the Vikings. He says, "Our towns were shaken of tall kings with scarlet beards like blood. The world turned empty where they trod. They took the kindly cross of God and cut it up for wood. Their souls were drifting as the sea, and all good town and lands they only saw with heavy eyes and broke with heavy hands." So that sense especially. Um, but then Alfred's King Alfred's response, several much later in the poem, about halfway through, he's speaking to the Vikings. He says, um, uh, "Therefore your end is on you and your kings. Not for a fire in Ely Fen, not that your gods are 9 or 10, but because it is only Christian men that guard even heathen things. For our God has blessed creation, calling it good. I know what spirit with whom you blindly band has blessed destruction with his hand. Yet by God's death the stars shall stand, and the small apples grow." So, um, but Chesterton and Tolkien and both of those two voices that you quoted, they're speaking really in the same milieu of looking at the destruction that and we look back at the 1880s, 1890s, and think, oh my goodness, it's like paradise back then. But they could see the writing on the wall. They could see the way that human history was turning. And now, how many stands of old growth forest are left anywhere? Um,
yes, very few, yeah.
anyway, on that somewhat sad note, we probably should wrap up. Before we move on, I had intended to make another pitch for Doxamut, which is the Orthodox Christian Tolkien conference. They were going to do it in over Labor Day weekend this year, but I have sad, late breaking news that for a variety of reasons, that event has been canceled for this year. So this is not the end of Doxamut, however. From what I'm hearing, we should have high expectations it will be back soon, maybe even next year, and with some exciting changes. For now, the only news is that it will not be happening this year, which means that it is now time for a somewhat different version of They're Taking the Hobbits to Isengard. Now, Mark, normally this part of the show is a quiz game, but because you have a particular rare and beautiful expertise, I want to take advantage of that and try something completely different. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to find, I said 3, but I ended up with 4 or 5. We'll see what we do. A few descriptions of trees from Tolkien's primary works, that is to say, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and then I'll read them to you, and I'll ask you either to try identifying the tree that is described, or to diagnose what's gone wrong with it, if appropriate, or if you prefer, you can just provide whatever other commentary seems appropriate to the circumstance. And as an aside, the word tree appears 928 times total in the entire Lord of the Rings, and that's not even counting branches and bark and so forth. So I had plenty of options to choose from. So the first quote is from Three's Company. So that's chapter 3, as the hobbits are hiding from the Black Rider on the first full day of their journey. And it says, a lane branched right, winding through a wood of ancient blank trees, on its way to Woodhall. That is the way for us, said Frodo. Not far from the road meeting, they came on the huge hulk of a tree. It was still alive, and had leaves on the small branches that it had put out round the broken stumps of its long fallen limbs. But it was hollow, and could be entered by a great crack on the side away from the road. The hobbits crept inside, and sat there upon a floor of old leaves and decayed wood. So, your options, Mark, as we said, identify, diagnose, or comment, or perhaps all 3. What would you say if someone called you and described this tree? Your professional.
If they asked me what type of tree is it, um, my my first guess would probably be a tree by a road. I mean, it could be with a big old hollow, but still alive. It makes me think of an oak just because there are some other trees with the ability to survive in highly compacted areas, and like a roadside, um, something that gets so large at the base. It makes me think of an oak, or um, uh, you know, uh, depending on when the path was established. That's the first. How long has the path been there?
Sure.
That was what
Well,
I'd
this is
say.
an ancient road, so but you are
Yeah, yeah.
correct. It is an oak tree,
Okay, okay.
in a wood of ancient oak trees. So, uh,
To still survive with being big and hollow, typically that's not the case with the willow. They would completely decline, uh, you know, sometimes in that situation. Beech trees don't do well by the road. I'm trying to think of Tolkien's landscape too, or what he would have experienced. So I was kind of thinking of that as well. Like,
right.
so
Well, I've scored this in
got
the
lucky.
past, and if we were scoring, then you are 1 for 1 so far. And so is Tolkien. He described the wood accurately, which of course we shouldn't be surprised by. Any diagnosis or comment you want to make about the tree as described besides that?
Probably died from the hollow probably happened from a struck by. If it was by an ancient road, somebody would have eventually hit it, and then and then the decay would have started. And if it decays too long, sometimes it becomes likely for a top to break out. Oftentimes by roads, you'll have lots of wind shear. So um, there's alleys created, so oftentimes you get a little more breakage than you would like deep into a forest. To have a whole top broken out and still getting plenty of sun, so the little sections of life on it can still sort of resprout. That's I guess these are all the thoughts I have.
Sure.
But yeah,
Very
yeah,
good, but not unrealistic is what you're saying. So
correct,
excellent.
correct,
All
yeah,
right,
yeah.
that's awesome. I hope that would go that well, but that's even better than
Got
I
lucky.
hoped. So for our second quote, we're looking ahead to the arrival of the fellowship in Eregion, which had also been called Holland. So there we find two passages, a couple pages apart, describing the trees which were characteristic of the region. So it says, the travelers reached a low ridge crowned with ancient blank trees, whose gray green trunks seemed to have been built out of the very stone of the hills. Their dark leaves shone, and their berries glowed red in the light of the rising sun. And then we skip ahead a few chapters after they try to climb over the pass and are turned back by the snow. They're heading towards Moria. A mile southwards along the shore, they came upon blank trees. Stumps and dead boughs were rotting in the shallows, the remains, it seemed, of old thickets or of a hedge that had once lined the road across the drowned valley. But close under the cliff there stood, still strong and living, two tall trees, larger than any trees of blank that Frodo had ever seen or imagined. Their great roots spread from the wall to the water. Under the looming cliffs they had looked like mere bushes when seen far off from the top of the stair, but now they towered overhead, stiff, dark, and silent, throwing deep night shadows about their feet, standing like sentinel pillars at the end of the road. So, once again, Mark, identify, diagnose, or comment, or perhaps all three.
Yeah, the first one makes me think of a holly tree, actually.
And you're,
Um,
you're right. It's a holly.
oh, okay. Okay.
Right in one.
Um, 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 Dead stumps and dead boughs were rotting in the shallows. Remains, let's see, old thickets, a hedge. Um, there stood still strong, living two tall trees. So the southwards along the shore.
Well, they're also hollies, so it's all holly
Okay, okay,
trees.
okay, okay,
Yeah,
okay, okay.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
Even down to the still strong and living two tall trees. That one's different,
yeah. No,
correct?
those are also supposed to be
Okay,
hollies.
okay,
So
okay, okay. Yeah, that would be shocking. I mean, yeah, there are holly trees that are tall, and it is shocking when you see them. Yeah, yeah,
so even that they do occasionally get that large, and they're that I couldn't pick a holly out of a lineup if I tried, but
yeah. If there are some in, I've seen some in Kentucky like
okay,
that. It's very shocking to see because yeah, they have the gray green trunks, or that are smooth like stone. You've got beech trees, and then you've got holly, and holly is really rare. So, but the berries, hollies have berries, so that was
sure,
one of the giveaways. When he says their roots spread from the wall to the water, that was interesting to me. It made me question if the other trees they found down lower were some other species, because I wasn't aware of them being real friendly to water, but there could be some variation in that species I'm not aware of. The ones I see in Kentucky, they can be that big, and they just grow right out of, a sandy area with no water around, so
sure.
yeah, kind of
Well, I
interesting.
think the idea of the plot here is that the water didn't used to be there. That when those trees were planted and when they grew up strong, and I assume then they would have a substantial root system, that the water wasn't there. So the idea, I'm guessing, would be that the water, after everything was blocked up, after the gate to Moria was closed, the water came up and it killed effectively the hedge of smaller holly trees, but that the two large ones were able to survive. Would that make sense, possibly, or
Yeah, there's lots of reasons that for that, and but yeah, the description too of like they were A small holly tree looks like a bush. A small oak tree looks like a small oak tree. You know, a small sycamore tree looks like a small sycamore tree, but the holly trees do sort of start out as kind of like a little shrub. So yeah, that's interesting.
Sure.
So yeah, a few little giveaways. He yeah, he spent a lot of time looking at trees. It's apparent to
Uh,
me.
sure.
He he doesn't they aren't, they fit with geographically, they seem to fit too,
Hmm.
with the landscape around them, so, yeah.
Perfect. All right, one more. This is from the beginning of the company's journey on the Great River. Uh, I think that these aren't even identified.
Okay.
He just tells us this. So he says, far into the dark, quiet hours they floated on, guiding their boats under the overhanging shadows of the western woods. Great trees passed by like ghosts, thrusting their twisted, thirsty roots through the mist down into the water. It was dreary and cold. Frodo sat and listened to the faint lap and gurgle of the river fretting among the tree roots and driftwood near the shore until his head nodded, and he fell into an uneasy sleep. So, uh, identify, diagnose, or comment these trees whose roots like the water.
Yeah, it almost, if they, uh I guess when he says trees pass like ghosts, I imagine, well, for his landscape, something like a London plane tree, or for us, that would be the American sycamore.
Okay.
Um, they grow right on the water. They can grow monstrously big. I think some of our champion-sized trees in Ohio, in terms of just size and age, are you know cottonwood, sycamore. Even some poplars, but poplars aren't as water loving as something like a London plane tree, which is like a sycamore.
Mm,
And you know, there's kind of an old saying that like sycamores are like the ghosts of the forest. So
uh huh.
uh, that's a striking image to me. When you look across a deciduous forest in the winter, you can see the shining white bark, you know, or very very thin bark, of those sycamores. So they do very much stand out, and it's easy to be surprised by a massive tree, whether you're hiking or canoeing. Like you would think you'd see it coming, but you usually do stumble upon it and just kind of get overwhelmed.
Sure. And
That is a common traveling experience that I have had.
And I feel
So,
like I've had a similar experience. We went canoeing on the Little Miami a couple times, and I think I've seen. Well, I don't know trees, but Presidenta, she's like, "That's a sycamore, and it's huge." I'm like, "Okay," and I'm being struck by, yeah, large and in the water. Okay.
yeah, and they'll grow right in the floodplain, right in the water, holding the bank together. Yeah,
Ha.
yeah,
Awesome.
literally roots in the water for most of their lives. Half of them, yeah, sometimes. Yeah.
Very good. All right. Well, I have another one. It's not really a matter of identification since he gives a potential identification, and there isn't really any more detail than that, but perhaps a question of diagnosis. Is this a healthy tree or happy tree? So this is from when Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli first arrive at Fangorn Forest. It says, a little way beyond the battlefield, they made their camp under a spreading tree. It looked like a chestnut, and yet it still bore many broad brown leaves of a former year, like dry hands with long splayed fingers. They rattled mournfully in the night breeze. So, maybe not identify unless you can, but diagnose, comment, thoughts.
Yeah. So chestnut trees, at least here in the United States, used to be some of our largest trees, east of the Mississippi. Um, I wonder how large they get there. Um, uh, yeah, I'm trying to think of what might look like a chestnut tree, but not be one. He would have certainly you would have certainly you don't you there is no confusion when you stumble underneath a large chestnut tree. They have spiny husks about the size of a baseball, that don't deteriorate very quickly. you quickly find yourself kind of uncomfortable under an old chestnut. Um, uh, but perhaps it could be something like should be something like a butternut tree. I think they have some of those over there that do get fairly large.
Okay.
That would be my guess. I would guess a butternut tree because most of those nuts kind of disappear with the underground feeding process, and they're not quite as they break down a little bit faster. I don't know if they hold their leaves very long though, so that would be the one thing that I wasn't sure about. But
Nonetheless, you've given at least insights on why he says it looked like a chestnut instead of it was, because that's
yeah, yeah, yeah.
interesting. All right. And then a bonus here, although it's not fair to ask you to identify a tree that, so far as I know, Tolkien invented, but I thought we should read this description from Lothlorien. And while we read this, I'm actually going to uh, I'm going to share my screen again because Tolkien did a piece of art of the forest of Lothlorien. And so we can see this maybe, and I think you can see this when I show it. Um, but this is his depiction here. So and then I'll read this. This is as they're going through Lorien and they've been blindfolded. So when they take the blindfolds off, this is what Frodo experiences. It says, when his eyes were in turn uncovered, Frodo looked up and caught his breath. They were standing in an open space. To the left stood a great mound covered with a sward of grass as green as springtime in the elder days. Upon it, as a double crown, grew two circles of trees. The outer had bark of snowy white and were leafless, but beautiful in their shapely nakedness. The inner were malorn trees of great height, still arrayed in pale gold. High amid the branches of a towering tree that stood in the center of all there gleamed a white flet. At the foot of the trees and all about the green hillsides the grass was studded with small golden flowers shaped like stars. Among them, nodding on slender stalks, were other flowers. White and palest green, they glimmered as a mist amid the rich hue of the grass. Over all the sky was blue, and the sun of afternoon glowed upon the hill and cast long green shadows beneath the trees. This is not a painting or a drawing of this scene, but at least the malorn trees there. Um, any thoughts on this particular description, Mark? What do you think Tolkien is getting at? Here, if getting at
Um,
is the right question, even.
yeah, I mean, I think he may be inventing his own tree, which might give you clues to some of the favorite features of the trees that were around him. Sort of like he you can only draw on you can only draw on the natural world so much to create something, right? The bark of snowy white is interesting, because that definitely would be something like the London plane tree has some white in it, not as much in Europe as our American sycamore. Um, leaf because they're beautiful in their nakedness. I mean, completely defoliated. They're a beautiful tree.
Hmm.
Um, uh, so I mean, perhaps he like picking out like some of his like favorite features and kind of like building a tree out of it. That's kind of what I imagine.
Sure.
He mentioned the double crown, and I don't know. Um, I wasn't sure exactly what he was getting at there. Um, uh, double crown,
I
right? Two circle
Right. I think
trees.
he's saying that just on the hillside, there's like two circles of trees, and the
Mm,
outer circle is these white barked,
mm,
leafless trees, and then the inner are these malorns.
okay. They're all kind of grown together.
Right. Um, when I hear a white tree, I assume aspens because I grew up with aspens out in the west, uh, but aspens don't grow by themselves.
Correct. Yeah.
So
You will have stands and stands and stands of those. I don't know how. I don't think their range is in his area,
yeah,
but he probably would have been familiar with them for sure.
sure.
Um, they're they are there are varieties of aspen. Uh, um, Perhaps I think he may be even drawing on some of his love of um, some varieties of birch, birch or aspen, because the whiteness, they glow, even in the winter. Yeah, so I'd imagine what you're hearing there are, some of his favorite features of the trees he has around him. Yeah, sort of creating his own. Um,
His own tree. His
mhm.
description of you have to look into the unfinished tales to find his best descriptions of Malorn trees, but they're an invented tree. They were supposed to only grow on the island of Numenor, and in the story of the mariner's wife, they're in unfinished tales. There's this absolutely heart-rendingly beautiful description of a forest. Uh, Remind me some next time I see you, and I'll show it to you. One of my previous guest co-hosts and a frequent flyer on the show, Dr. Cyril Jenkins, I believe it was. He had picked not Dr. Jenkins. Sorry, it was Father Paul Hodge. You might actually know Father Paul Hodge. He's an OCA priest from well, and now OCA priest from near Minneapolis, I believe. But he picked something from that, and just gorgeous. I'll show you the passage. But um, okay, one more image then, and then we should probably move on. So this is a different sort of thing that Tolkien would depict, and forgive the curved the curvature of the page. I couldn't get a flat photo of this, but this is from the this is supposed to be well, he labeled this as different things. He started it as a forest in the Silmarillion, and then he relabeled it as a picture from Fangorn Forest, and then redrew it as Mirkwood. But what would you say about these trees? Are these happy trees? Are these healthy? Is this an old growth forest? Is this sickly? What are we looking at here?
Oh, the fastness of southern Mirkwood that you're
Yes,
referring to,
yes.
clad in a forest of dark fir, where the trees strive one against another, and their branches rot and wither. In the midst of a stony height stands Dol Guldur, where long the hidden enemy had his dwelling.
Well, that was the other
So
quote, but yeah.
yeah, if you arrive in um, a forest of fir trees that is, let's say, um, I would say if it was transitioning between, it wasn't an old growth forest really, but it was a large stand of trees that kind of grew up all at the same time.
Uh huh.
See this a lot with fir trees in that are used for as a commodity in fields grown like corn. Uh, they are incredibly dense and dark. Because all the bigger old trees, you don't have a variety creating pockets of light with big and small. I imagine it. Um, uh, they strive more against one another when they're all kind of something happens when they all grow up sort of at the same height. You see that more. Um,
So Tolkien's
um,
describing an unhealthy forest here. As he's describing the forest near the necromancer who exploits everything, he's describing an exploitative forest.
It seems to me, yeah, because you don't, you don't get such dense, I've been in old growth fir forests. There's lots of light. There's giants and there's little, 5-foot tall ones, and usually clad with ferns and other things. If you have like a sort of a monoculture of just, like a regrown tree, and they're all 20, 30 feet tall. Even 20, 30 feet tall, you have almost no light um, underneath you. It's a thick blanket where yeah, it's not a good situation for a healthy forest. Yep, yep.
Right. One more thing then, and I'm going to try to show you this picture because I know it's hard to see. Are you able to see this at all? This
Yeah.
painting. Uh, I was trying to show this before, but I wanted to do the quote, and you read it, so that's perfect. But what would you say is going on? Are these healthy, happy trees? What kind of trees are they? What does this look like?
Hmm. Um, it looks like you've got, it looks like he's sort of, the depiction there, um, kind of looks like to me, uh, a forest of mostly similar trees, which is common. You get dense stands of you have different sizes in the picture, so that depicts a healthier. Uh, it depicts a little bit healthier situation, and you've got a little bit of diversity. Oftentimes, if you uh, in many different places, if you hike long distances, you will transition from one. Whether it's your elevation that changes or um, it's typically an elevation change, um, uh, or you get into different valleys where the soil changes. Your tree species will kind of all change at once, and then you'll have a couple different species sort of like tucked in there from sort of accidental plantings of things. It's very common. If you walk the coastline, let's say you're up in northern Michigan and you're walking the coastline, you would find yourself in a stand of almost all um, sugar maples. A few minutes later, you go down a hill, you find yourself almost completely surrounded by birch. You get a few hemlock trees, and the next thing you know, it's just hemlocks, and then you go uphill a little more, you're back into sugar maples. So the to have a consistency with just a few other things scattered in there. That's a typical experience, Um, you know, finding a forest that has like an older forest that has like a really diverse, you know, oh, there's 7 different species right here. Sometimes you get that, but you tend to find like a few things in different areas, and large stands of similar trees like firs and hemlocks, cedars kind of all together, and then transitions to birches and maples. And yeah.
Mark, that's perfect. All of your commentary is wonderful and much appreciated. I feel like we've gotten a little bit of the deeper commentary on trees with you that Legolas might have been able to provide if he'd been given a little bit more dialogue in the books. So thank you for guiding us on a side trail that involves absolutely no encounters with the Uruk-hai. Next time, however, for future guest co-hosts, do not expect to escape the quizzes unless you can bring something as valuable as Mark to the table. All right. And that's all we've got for today. Thank you, Mark, for co-hosting the Amon Sûl podcast with me today. I am really, again, as I said, I'm thrilled to actually get to talk to you in general. To talk to you about Tolkien is a blessing and a privilege, and to talk to you about Tolkien and trees, well, that's just a treat. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, and your love for the natural world with me and with the listeners.
Thank you for having me.
So next time on Amon Sûl, I'll be joined by listener Rob Clark as we begin our time with Tom Bombadil and Goldberry and begin our 3 episodes grappling with the big question of who he is and what he is doing in our story. You can send your questions, comments, topic suggestions, or orcish ideas for their taking the hobbits to Isengard to me at amonsul@ancientfaith.com or by messaging me through the podcast Facebook page. We also welcome guest co-host proposals, so if you have a chapter you'd like to discuss with us, please make us a pitch. Lastly, we would love to receive more photograph submissions of landscapes that resemble Weathertop and the Weather Hills approaching it. The photo that currently features during the podcast opening on YouTube is of the Book Cliffs near Grand Junction, Colorado, submitted by listener Rolf Solli. It's a different sort of terrain, but it certainly fits the basic gist of Amon Sûl, and the southwestern mountains and sky make me homesick. So please send us more. We'd love to grow our portfolio, and especially if any of you live near Escudilla Mountain in the White Mountains of Arizona and could take a photo of that mountain that Mark was talking about, please send that, because that would be a beautiful Amon Sûl. I was just looking it up, and yes, please. But wherever you live, if you live or work or commute in the vicinity of Weathertop, please share your view with us.
If you want more of this kind of thing, subscribe to Amon Sûl Podcast on your favorite podcast app, and please rate and review, and look up the Amon Sûl Podcast page on Facebook. Click the follow button. Most of all, though, share with your friends. And while you're at it, if you appreciate this or other Ancient Faith media, go to ancientfaith.com/support and show some practical love.
We've been around since 2019, and you can find our full back catalog of episodes by going to tolkienpodcast.com or just, subscribing on your podcast app. The Amon Sûl podcast theme music is Hidden Past, and the closing theme is Celtic Impulse, and all of this music is by Kevin MacLeod, whose music you can find at incompetech.com.
Our podcast cover art was created by Samuel Hebel. Our video editors / Palantir geniuses are Simon Nelson and Mike DeGan.
And special thanks go to the Amon Sûl Facebook group for conversation, inspiration, and not so infrequent reflections on what actual stewardship of the creation would look like, and I'm totally serious about that. I am your host, Father Anthony Cook, and even though Father Andrew receives a proposal for an ASMR podcast starring Old Man Willow every time he hears me say it, this has been a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.